The Enforcement Directorate has filed a charge sheet against Chinese loan apps. The ED has said that they found that Chinese loan apps were charging up to 2,300% interest on loan amounts. On non-payment, Chinese loan apps were threatening women of sexual intercourse and portray her as a call girl. Charge sheet also says that in these difficult times of the pandemic, when people lost their jobs and poor people were under heavy financial stress and their need of funds had increased, this is when these apps targeted these vulnerable people. These companies took advantage of the situation, made the borrowers subject to harassment, blackmailing, extortion, and even abuse. This is not the first time that CNN News 18 is focusing on how these Chinese loan apps work and more particularly how they target the vulnerable. And once again, now we're picking up more details of a charge sheet that in fact has been filed by the Enforcement Directorate, which once again talks about how this harassment continues with people who fall prey to these Chinese loan apps. All of this with links to China. These are companies that actually don't have a real front. They only target people who are vulnerable, who need that money immediately, and then blackmail them. So, for example, if somebody has, taken a loan of 10,000 rupees, the end amount that they end up paying could be in lakhs. And that's why we've seen a lot of people taking that extreme step of even dying by suicide because they just cannot deal with the harassment anymore. And once again, as part of this charge sheet of the Enforcement Directorate, we're understanding how they particularly targeted these vulnerable people and how they blackmailed and harassed women as well. How they told women that if this amount is not repaid with the interest that they're looking at, then their pictures would be put out online. Not the first time that we're focusing on this harassment, but let's bring in our colleague Ashish Mehrishi also, who in fact keeps a very close eye on the agencies and what the charge sheet is putting out for our viewers. Ashish, as I was pointing to our viewers, not the first time that CNN News 18 has exposed what these Chinese loan apps did with victims, how they identified the most vulnerable and then harassed them. But take us through the big 5 takeaways as far as this charge sheet is concerned.
So, if you see the charge sheet, what the charge sheet basically says on how they were basically targeting vulnerable people, people who were poor in nature, people who basically lost their jobs during pandemics, and they were basically in need of money. But here, what they were basically doing is that in case you need a loan of, say, 5,000 rupees for 7 to 14 days, they used to deduct around 1,500 rupees as platform charges. And subsequently, 36% was charged. But effectively, when you see what was the charge that was coming on your head, the rate of interest used to be more than 2,000%. So a person who basically borrowed 5,000 actually got 3,500 in hand and was paying around 5,800 rupees in 7 to 14 days time, which is mind-boggling. Interestingly, there is no law which basically stops them from doing so. If you see what the RBI circular says, that there should be fair trade practices, but then the fair trade practices are not followed. So, even if somebody wants, if there is no way the borrower basically, if they want, if the lender wants to harass the borrower, they can easily do it. So here, the Chinese loan apps basically took advantage out of this situation, and ultimately we have already seen a number of complaints where women were being harassed. They were being told they will be raped, they will be their photos will be circulated on adult websites. They will be tagged as call girls or whatever. So this is something absolutely really surprising.
Right. Ashish, I also want to understand a little more as far as this harassment is concerned. We're also understanding, as you were rightly pointing out, that women were threatened that their personal pictures are going to be used and put out on adult websites so that they know that the payment would come back sooner. We are also understanding some sort of default messages which had the word chore in it was also sent. And more importantly, there is an Indian company that has been named in this charge sheet as well.
So, there are so many companies which have been named. Most of these companies were run by Chinese individuals. These Chinese individuals have escaped out of India. There are lookout circulars pending against them as of now. But interestingly, at least in one case, a company like Razorpay was taken for a ride. In fact, they also did not realize that they are being used by the Chinese individuals. And, the Razorpay basically chose to ignore the proper KYC guidelines that should have been adopted. And, transactions worth almost 44 crore rupees were done from their platform. And finally, it was basically
Okay, we just seem to have lost that audio with Ashish Merishi. We'll try and reestablish that connection. But our colleague Ashish Merishi now getting us a charge sheet, which in fact has been filed by the Enforcement Directorate, once again speaking about the harassment that these Chinese loan apps continued with their victims, how they identified the most vulnerable and then blackmailed them. Ashish is now back with us. Ashish, please go ahead.
So, in one of the cases where one of the companies did not even know that their account or their name is being used, their KYC is being used, ultimately it was found that, huge amount of transactions were done from the payment aggregator like the Razorpay. And, the penny test failed. They still continued. They, a fake check was given to them. So, even Indian payment aggregators have been taken for a ride by these Chinese individuals. But it is basically, if you go through the entire chat sheet, one thing is absolutely visible, that the guidelines or the regulatory framework is very weak. And the Chinese individuals or the Chinese apps have basically taken advantage out of that situation.
Right. Ashish, we'll just request you to stay on with us, because this is a story which is very important for our viewers to see, so that they know what are the kind of red flags that they shouldn't fall into. We also have cyber expert Amit Dubey now joining us on the broadcast. So good to have you on the broadcast with us. Help us understand, as Ashish is pointing out, their target is very clear. They look at the most vulnerable and then they start harassing them. But what is that entire process of them actually taking on the data? When does that happen?
See, first of all these Chinese apps, they have few things in common. That they take your photos, videos, and contact details. So, and that you can check easily on Play Store as well when you are installing this app. Even before installation, you can open the details section of it, and you can see that what all permissions do they take from your phone. They take your camera, microphone, photos, videos, contact list, locations, everything. Now, if they know so much about you, they can easily threaten you. They can easily extort money from you while creating morph images and videos about you and sending it to your friends, network, and parents, and even close-knit relatives. And that's where people start panicking, and they start paying money even in retaliation, and they pay more money than they have taken. And sometimes they even commit suicide. So this is something which is a typical modus operandi, and they are targeting especially the women at home and also the senior citizens. And these are the people that are most vulnerable. They can't share sometimes these details, because when they have taken loans, they were actually in high distress and they could not share it with their family members that time. So most of these loans were taken in a time when they could not actually take it from anybody else. So they wanted to hide it. And that is where the trap actually happens. And eventually, for a long time, they don't share this information with anybody and live in that distress.
And we've seen multiple victims, and that's exactly what we were pointing out to our viewers, because they are so embarrassed and the harassment still continues. They don't know where to get the money from. Many of them end up taking that extreme step of ending their life as well. But if Ashish is still with us, Ashish, what I also want to essentially understand, this is not the first time that we're focusing on this entire nexus of these Chinese loan apps. We do know that their servers have been traced back to China. The biggest problem, and this is what most cyber experts have pointed out, is that when you look at them on any app store, they look so authentic, they look so real that anybody can fall into it. So what is the way of cracking around it? Because if these apps continue to find a different domain name and continue to creating more apps every day and they look so real, then how will somebody even know that they could be falling into a trap?
So, one has to realize the fact that people who are usually not very educated in terms of how the cyber crime can be done, or how your contacts or how your data can be used by companies like the Chinese apps were doing. This needs to be basically educated among people. There is no doubt about it. But what was happening, at least if you go through the chart sheet, what one has to see is that these loan apps, what they were doing. Once you default on one payment, so you will be instigated by another loan app, and you will basically borrow from there to give money to another loan company. And interestingly, if you go behind these loan apps, it will be the similar company. So you basically fall into that vicious cycle